everyone, and welcome to Better Informed Housing. I'm Margot Ruark. I'm the host of the show today, and with us is attorney Faisal El-Khatib.
Hello, Margot. Thank you for having me.
Yes. Better Informed Housing, before we get started, is an Illinois not-for-profit foundation, or organization rather, and providing education and information to communities about real estate. And for more information as the program goes along, you can write to Faisal or call the Better Informed Housing Office at 312-775-0980. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest today. You have an impressive background in corporate transactions, including real estate development, consumer products, and manufacturing. Over 20 years you've been involved in the business community, and you have managed, you have built and structured and restructured small and medium-sized corporations. You are especially in tune with overcoming the challenges that arise from a series of singular decisions, financial hurdles, and the growth pains that affect businesses one way or another. So you have participated and supported many not-for-profit organizations that help build communities and support networks to empower various populations.
Well, thank you, Margaret, for that intro. It's humbling, but yes, thank you. I guess today what we wanted to talk about, and the subject is lease transactions, and specifically commercial leases. And it has to do with housing because in many cases you've got landlords who are leasing to multiple unit buildings or multi-unit buildings, or there's also commercial leases for storefronts or even offices and businesses. So it's an expansive subject. And what I figured we would do is to go over some of the various terms that people come across when they are entering into a lease transaction. And these leases, you'll find some of these lease terms in residential leases as well as commercial leases. So we have it's a little bit of a overhead here to take a look at. So what I did was I pulled a basic table of contents that you'd find in a lease to talk about the different sections and the terms that you would come across in a lease transaction. So coming back to here, so we have, for example, one of the things that we'll find in a commercial lease transaction is delivery of possession. And what this applies to both residential as well as commercial leases. Delivery of possession, Margot, is when when the landlord will deliver the property to the lessee or the renter at the time of possession. So when the lease, and sometimes it's different from the lease date. Sometimes you'll sign the lease 1 month and won't take possession, which is go into the property and occupy the property a month or two later, or sometimes even longer, depending on if there's things that need to be fixed or arranged or built out into the unit. So, and if you have any questions, by the way, while I'm going through this, feel free to call us. A number you'll find at the bottom of the page at 312-738-1060. We are a live show, and you can call us at any time. So we'll take your call when you call. The next section I want to talk about is rent. So rent has many different meanings. There could be a triple net lease, essentially where you're only paying, the landlord doesn't pay for anything, and the occupant, the lessee, pays for everything. So they pay the rent, and then they have to cover all the expenses for taxes, they have to cover all the expenses for insurance. So they're paying rent plus everything else. Rent sometimes in residential leases means that you're paying rent and they'll include your utilities, or they'll include your taxes, so there's no extra fees or costs. In a commercial lease, what they'll do is they'll break out the rent, so you'll have rent and you'll have a CAM, which is the common area maintenance. So the maintenance to shovel the parking lot when it's snowing, to cut the grass along the property lines. All that is common area maintenance. Fixing the HVACs, which are the air conditioning and heating units in a building, those are common area maintenance, or can be. The next area is security deposits. Now, this is important. There's a huge difference in security deposit when it comes to landlords, when it comes to commercial properties and residential. On a commercial property, a security deposit represents usually 1 month or 2 months or multiple months of rent that the landlord has to hold and keep in possession. That's very similar to a residential security deposit, but if you live within the city of Chicago city limits, you have specific requirements as a landlord that you have to maintain a separate account for the security deposit. It has to incur a certain amount of interest based on the interest rate at the time, which is not a lot these days, but you still have to do that. And if you don't, those can be violations under the landlord-tenant ordinance or the RLTO. That does not apply to commercial leases. So the next thing we want to talk about is restrictions of use. Now, this is important in a commercial setting. So in a residential, obviously you're going to live there. There may be restrictions on your ability to run a business or operate or work from home. So some people have a at-home business where they work from their home office. Some residential leases will not allow you to do that. Some buildings will not allow you to conduct business from your location, from your house. On the commercial side, the idea of getting in is you're establishing that you are taking it for a business purpose. So they may restrict your ability in terms of the types of businesses you can run out and operate out of that shop or out of that location. For example, if there's an exclusivity, it could be that that no other nail salons can be located at that location in that entire strip center. So that way there's an exclusivity allowed. So if you want to come in, go ahead.
Oh, and two, I just from my own experience, if you want to rent and you're going to have an income tax service in a retail area, that might not be allowed. And so, you have to really investigate these things before you sign on. I have another question for you.
Sure.
I have an acquaintance who has a studio, a yoga studio, and he was living there as well because there was like a little space with a kitchen, and of course, there was space for him to live there.
Okay.
And he did live there until the landlord found out and shut them down. Now,
Okay.
what goes on there? What happened?
So
Yeah.
you'd have to look at his lease, but it's very possible that in the lease agreement it said that you could not live on the property, that it's only for commercial purposes and not for residential purposes. And the reason being is if there was a problem, then it becomes very blurry as to whether he was renting it as a studio for business purposes or was he renting it from the landlord for residential purposes, and then he would fall under certain guidelines. And I think we have a caller.
Yes, we do have a caller. Do you have a question or comment for us? Go ahead, caller.
Yes. My question is, I live in a co-op, and I want to know, is living in a co-op is the same as living as in a commercial type residential?
So, interesting question. So, living in a co-op, and just let me explain quickly for everybody who's listening what a co-op is. A co-op essentially is like a condo building, but they have not broken up the building into separate condos. So by that, for example, you'll have 100 units in a building, and each unit will be a separate condo that an owner will own and buy. So it'll have a PIN number, its own taxes. The person who lives there or bought it will own it outright, separate from everybody else. Now, before the condominium law became a law and allowed to do that, people used to do co-ops. This is very popular in New York. So a co-op essentially is where the entire building is a corporation, and a person doesn't buy into the building based on they buy a specific unit, but their purchase is not of a real estate property or PIN number. For example, we're not buying unit 17A. What they're buying is shares in the corporation of the total co-op. That's different. It's still a residential transaction because you're acquiring even though you're acquiring shares in a corporation, it is for your residence, and it's different than a commercial lease or commercial transaction. Co-ops are very, very particular as to how lenders will work with it. a lot of lenders don't like co-ops because of its complications in terms of trying to foreclose or take ownership of it if there's a problem. So by nature, it is a commercial transaction. It is a transaction, like a corporate transaction, because you're acquiring shares in a corporation. And it has different guidelines that would apply versus the traditional condominium law.
Okay, let's.
We have another caller.
Okay, do you have a question or comment?
No, it's still me. I had another question.
Please, go ahead.
Your question?
Go ahead.
If, like what I said, when I moved up in here, you had to pay, like, you had to put $3,000 down as part of your, I'm not sure if they would use this as your deposit or part of your rental fees or whatever. But anyway, once you move, are you entitled to that deposit back?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question. So, you put a deposit down to acquire the property, or you put a deposit down to rent from a co-op?
Yeah, to rent from the co-op. It was part of the what you had to do in order to. They said you just had to.
So if you're renting from the co-op,
get into the union.
if you're living there and you're renting from the co-op, so you're paying rent to the co-op because the co-op owns that unit or owns, I guess, those shares related to that unit, then you'd be under a residential lease agreement, which is would be covered by the RLTO. Now, do you own in the co-op, or do you just rent from the co-op?
No, I don't own anything. We pretty much just what they call we pay association fees.
So you're paying association fees, or you're paying rent?
Pretty much. I think I'm paying rent.
I think so. So essentially, your rental agreement with the co-op is a rental agreement under the RLTO. So it's not a commercial transaction. It is purely residential, and you're protected by the real estate landlord-tenant ordinance, which allows you to make sure that you secure the deposit and the money that you put into the co-op, you'll get that back, so long as you're a renter from the co-op. You should probably have a written lease agreement with the co-op. If you don't, I would get one.
Okay.
So thank you for your question, caller.
Thank you. You know, you're watching Better Informed Housing, which is a live program on CanTV 21 and online as well at cantv.org/hotline. And you can reach Faisal El-Khatib here at Better Informed Housing at 312-775-0980 at mfaisal@evlawgroup.com.
So, thank you for your question. Now, I figured to move on to the additional pieces on the item. So there's a couple other things that I wanted to raise that I think that are important, and you should be aware of. So, for example, under certain things, for example, who is responsible for the utilities, who's responsible for the maintenance. So on residential contracts and agreements, that's usually the landlord has to make sure that everything is operating. So they'll take care of the bathroom, the plumbing, the heating, the cooling. They'll take care of that. In some cases, they'll say the landlord won't pay utilities, you have to pay your own utilities. Or in some cases, the utilities are included in the rent. So those are the types of things that will happen. Now, it's similar to that in a commercial setting. In commercial, there's two types, like I said earlier. Either the landlord pays for everything, you're getting a bulk rate, and you're paying everything included, or it's all broken out and the tenant has to pay individually. So, and maintenance is usually handled by, it can be both ways. Either the tenant handles all their own maintenance, or the landlord handles the maintenance. Usually the maintenance for a large building or a large commercial strip center is handled by the landlord. For everything outside the unit and everything inside the unit is the responsibility of the tenant. So going on to a few other areas that I feel that are important. So for example, one of the things that I try to do to make sure is to ensure that the liability on my client, whoever that would be, whether it's the tenant or the landlord, is reduced. So when it's on the tenant, we want to make sure the responsibilities are as much on the landlord than they are on the tenant. And if it's the landlord I'm representing, I want the landlord to have fewer responsibilities. And that's just kind of a style of negotiation that I do when I'm trying to represent either party. The other thing that I would talk about is condemnation. So essentially condemnation is when a village or a city comes in and says they want to take over a building for whatever purposes. And you saw this a lot, if you remember, during the O'Hare expansion. Mm-hmm. So when Daley would come in and wanted to expand O'Hare Airport into the various villages and studies and annexed certain areas of certain villages near the airport to add another runway and to increase the size of the airport, one of the things that they did was they at times had to condemn properties. And what they would do is the city has to pay a fair share, a fair value, market value for the property. Now the question is, why is it important for a tenant? For a landlord, it's great, because the landlord could structure that if it's condemned, then they no longer have to honor the lease, they get to break the lease and the tenant has to move out. And they get full market value, or a large market value, or a value for the property that could be very profitable. For a tenant, this could be a problem because it'll shut down your business. And I've had several clients who suffered from that, specifically when they did the expansion at Midway. They had a store there, they lost the store because they expanded. And so what ended up happening was they lost their business, they had to shut down, they could not open up anywhere else, but the landlord who owned the property made a killing, and the owner of the store didn't make a lot of money because they only paid them for relocation. So one of the things you want to probably include as a tenant in that is certain rights and condemnation that more than your relocation, lost business, lost opportunity, those are types of things that you can add into a lease that give you better and more protection.
How about temporary issues? Like many suburbs, I know, and even in Chicago, the streets and the infrastructure is being renovated, the streets are torn up. Actually, customers could not even get in there to make a purchase. But it's not condemned, it's just short term. 3 months, 6 months, 9 months,
So
whatever. Yeah.
That's a problem that a lot of tenants actually puts tenants out of business. And unfortunately, both the tenant and the landlord are in detriment at this point. So really what you want to do, what I would do, it's really more of a business thing as opposed to a legal thing, because essentially the fact that you have signed a lease, you're liable for that lease payment no matter what. Whether you have good business or bad business, business goes up or business goes down. That isn't the job or the responsibility of the landlords. That really falls on the tenant. Now, I've seen situations where when they do those repairs and they shut down buildings and shut down and restrict customer access, where people will try to sue the village for lost business opportunity, and that has failed in many cases. So it's tough when they're doing those types of things. I have clients of mine who have suffered from that and actually went out of business because of it. So I'm sure there's a remedy and there are options, opportunities out there. What I would recommend usually is if those things are happening, it's always best to negotiate with the landlord and find out what opportunities there are, or maybe even include that in your lease, that in the event of any restriction or access or inability of clients to reach your location, then that would be something you can negotiate into the lease to make sure that protects the tenant. And one of the things
also, and to show your contract to a real estate
I
attorney,
was just going to say
so-
that. I was going to say that. A lot of people think that they want to save money and not go to an attorney to look at their lease contract, whether it's commercial or even residential. That's the worst thing you could do. You want to have a trained attorney in litigation who can talk to and look at that contract for you. Because the last thing you need is a lawyer to look at it when it's too late. And now you're looking at a lawsuit or facing a lawsuit against you or having to file a lawsuit to protect your interests. So getting an attorney involved as early as possible might cost you a little bit more money, but it'll save you a lot of money in the long run. So yeah, it's a very important question.
Yeah. So if you have questions about this, be sure to call in. We have a few minutes left. Call in 312-738-1060, and we can take your questions right on the air.
So I figured I'd move on to other things. So the other piece is talking about in terms of in commercial lease agreements that a lot of times they'll ask you to waive your rights, and that's a very dangerous thing. Now, we understand why they want those waivers. However, you don't have to waive your rights in a lease contract. Waivers in residential contracts are totally unacceptable, and they're actually illegal. They violate the RLTO. So if there is a waiver in your lease agreement as a resident, you should find an attorney and bring that up. The other thing that I want to talk about is modifications to agreement. So there are provisions in the contract that allows modification to the agreement by agreement of the parties, which means, so let's say something happens and changes. For example, as you were saying, well, there is a when there is a when you want to negotiate because they've shut down the street because they're doing repairs, that can be something that can be modified in the agreement. Lastly, I know we only have a few minutes left. I do want to talk about guarantees. You don't have to sign a guarantee. That's not a requirement. And what I've advised my clients is to sometimes you can increase the security deposit, maybe give it 3 or 4 months instead of actually signing a guarantee, or you can increase the term from 1 year to 2 years to 3 years in order to avoid having to sign a guarantee.
A guarantee of?
A personal guarantee.
Oh, okay.
So, which means that if you're signing, then you're personally on the hook in case you can't afford to pay the rent. So, avoiding guarantees at all possibility is definitely the preferred way to go.
Okay. So, if you want to get a hold of Faisal here at Better Informed Housing, give him a call at 312-775-0980 or email him at mfaisalevlawgroup.com. So I want to say thank you so much for joining us here.
My pleasure.
On Better Informed Housing, and thank you for your questions from the viewing audience, and we will be back again real soon.
See you next month. Thank you. Take care.